Well, thank you for coming tonight to this workshop to talk about the pre-application process for Community Preservation Act funds. My name is Kristen Stelgis. I'm the Community Preservation Act Manager. So I'm just going to walk you through how to apply for CPA funds for a project that a community member is proposing on city land, and then to talk about the new feasibility study program that we have. So just an overview of CPA, because the Community Preservation Act is very specific about what we can and can't do. It's important to kind of be aware. So Community Preservation Act is a state legislation, so it's only in Massachusetts. 172 municipalities have adopted it. And it can fund things in 4 areas: affordable housing, historic preservation, and open space recreational land. There's 3 ways that we get money for this program. One is a surcharge on property tax, it's 1.5%, and an optional city appropriation each year. And then the state matches our funding. So to date, we've received over $2 million from the state in support of the program, which is great. The legislation is very specific about what we can and cannot fund. And so if your project doesn't fit into one of these boxes, and you have the same table in your packet, the back of the the pre-application form, unfortunately CPA is not a good fit for your project. So the first thing that we do in thinking about a project is it eligible or not? That's the first distinction. And so you can see these. We can acquire in all of the categories. Tonight we're focusing on open space recreation and historic preservation. Housing is managed by our Somerville Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So we can acquire, preserve, and rehabilitate historic land, and we can acquire, create, and preserve open space and outdoor recreation. The difference between open space and recreation land is we usually in Somerville, we talk about all of our parks as open space. In the CPA, the definition is kind of wild lands like wetlands, conservation land. So most of our land falls into the recreation category. So that's parks, playgrounds, community gardens, things like that. Each year, the Community Preservation Committee decides how they want to apportion the funds across the 3 categories. And that's actually what the hearing tonight is about, is to get input on how to do this. The state requires that we put 10% towards each category as a minimum. From fiscal year 15, which is the first year project funds were awarded, to the current year where we are, fiscal 18, 45% of funding has been given to affordable housing and 15% each to open space and historic preservation. 5% goes for administration, which is to pay my salary and to print photocopies and do things like that. And the 20% flexible can only go to an eligible project in one of the 3 categories, but it allows the Community Preservation Committee to make adjustments to what they fund based on the applications that come in. For example, at the beginning of the program, a lot of historic projects were coming in. Now we're seeing fewer historic and more open space. So that gives them the flexibility each year to respond to those changes. So these are very preliminary estimates about how much money we're going to have available for next year. And that's in part because the May tax bills haven't started to come in yet. But at a minimum, we think we'll have about $1.8 million for projects. If we funded at the 10% minimum, that would be about $128,000 per category. If we did the 15% minimums, that would be $273,000, with the flexible of the $364,000. Now that may not be what the committee decides to put forward, but that's just to give you kind of ideas about how much funding might be available for your particular category. This is the application timeline. It's on the back of this document, your guide to proposing a project on city land. And Mark, I'll get you some as soon as we finish the formal portion. So the first step is the pre-applications are due on May 16th. So that's your first step. I'm guessing that's why you're here tonight, is because you're thinking about applying for submitting a pre-application. I will let you know what the determination is by June 8th, and then you would enter the process. Eligibility determination forms, which is when the Community Preservation Committee formally determines eligibility, Those are due July 18th. You would do that in conjunction with your co-applicant, or if you decide then your co-applicant is going to kind of pick up the application process for you, they would submit that. And then full applications are due on September 25th at noon. Once you have your full application in, the next step is to do a public presentation. Those are going to be scheduled for October, tentatively for the 11th and 24th. And then we're estimating that the CPC is going to submit their recommendations for submission to the board, which gives the final approval in December. So the money would hit the bank account of the project in probably February or March. So in the pre-application process, this is needed if you are a community member and you want to propose a project on city land. This is because the Community Preservation Committee requires that all projects on public land have the owner of that land as a co-applicant to make sure they're on board. And if you want to apply for feasibility study funds. So if you have an idea and you're not quite sure it'll work, this is a way to kind of help you get a little bit of resource and support to make that determination. So if you're doing it for a community project on city land, you submit the 2-page form that you have in your hand that looks like this. Then what happens is I share it with the relevant department. So if you want to do something related to a park or open space, I would share it with one of our parks planners. And they will decide how they want to proceed. This is only the second year we've done this, and we only had one last year, and the city agreed to sign on. So we're going to continue to learn how this is going to work. But the city can do one of 4 things. They can say, yes, we're going to sign on. The other is to say, let's continue to develop this idea and plan to submit it later, but we're not ready for this year. The other is to encourage participation in an existing process. If you have an idea for a park that the city knows is going to be renovated in a year, they may say, we're going to get there, please be a part of that process. Or say, we can't do it at this time, and that could be that they have some concerns about the project, or it could be the fact that we have 2 parks planners or 2 preservation staff, and the amount of work they have, they're just not able to be a good partner to the project at the time, and so they may not be able to do it. And so then I'd get back to you, and then at that point you decide if you're going to go into submitting an eligibility determination form, and it would be up to you to talk with your co-applicant about what that process is going to look like. And then I'm always here as a resource to you to help facilitate that process. If your idea is not quite maybe there and you think it would be helpful to have some technical assistance to get it there and make sure it's going to be a successful project, you can say that you'd like feasibility study funding. And through this, the city will have to establish the contract with the technical expert. You and I and the Community Preservation Committee would kind of agree what scope of services you need and would come up with an agreement. But the kinds of things that you maybe could get some help with is to have a public process around your project idea. If you're applying for design funding to redo existing open space, like a lot of that may happen already as part of the project that you're going to do, but if you have kind of a new idea that would take something maybe in a different way, maybe it would be a good idea to know if people are on board before you apply for funding. If you needed to do a survey, if you're not quite sure the bounds or kind of topography, if you're not quite sure what something might cost, and also if you need technical advice about what physically would be possible in a space, those are some options for you. So assuming the city signs on, if you do a feasibility study, the results say that sounds great, you enter the funding process. And so the way that the decisions are made is there's a 9-person body, that's the Community Preservation Committee I've been talking about. Uma is the vice chair of the committee, and she's one of our general public members. So we have 4 at-large members and then 5 ex officio that represent the different categories. So you have Planning Board, Historic Preservation, the Housing Authority, the Conservation Commission. And no matter where I start, I always forget one of the 5. Uma, who did I forget? It's okay. So Conservation Commission, Historic Preservation, Housing Authority, Planning Board. Wait, we'll remember. If we'll think of it and tell you when it comes to our minds. And then there is an annual process for application, but if you have a time-sensitive opportunity, the CPC will consider your ideas out of order. And as I mentioned before, the Affordable Housing Trust makes grants for housing projects, so you'll enter into a different process. And if you have an idea for funding that or know somebody who might, that funding round is currently open. So the Community Preservation Committee looks for the following things. The first, as I said, is this project eligible? That's why you have this eligibility determination phase, which is between the full application and the pre-application, to make sure that we actually can fund that project with CPA funds. Are all of the necessary stakeholders involved in your project? If not, maybe a feasibility study would help you get there. Is it going to provide a benefit to Somerville residents? Projects have to be fully publicly open. So if you wanted to do a community garden for a neighborhood and only have it be available for people in that neighborhood, that would not be a CPA eligible project. It would have to be available to everyone in Somerville. How well does the project match the community preservation plan priorities? They'll be discussing those after this meeting tonight. You can see them, they're posted around the room. And in general, is the project a good use of public resources? If you would like to receive the funds directly, you need to be a legally recognized entity. If it's a group of community members, the city will need to receive the funds, and you need to work through the city because we don't have a mechanism to give funding to someone who's not, or an organization that's not a 501c3 or equivalent. Or also, if you have an idea for a project that's on private land that you don't own, you need to have very clear permission from that property owner. And as we said, if the whole purpose of the pre-application process is for having your co-applicant if you're on city land. If you wanted to apply for a project on state land, you need to work through that relevant state agency. If you don't have a contact there, I can help you make those connections. And for eligibility determination, if you have a historic project, it needs to be determined to be historically significant, either because it's already a local historic district or on the state register or national register, or go through a process with the Community Preservation Commission to determine that it is indeed a historically significant resource. And we can talk about that if that's relevant to any of you. And then this is the list of things that you would need to do at the full narrative stage. There's some narrative prompts that you need to respond to. There's a budget, because a lot of these are very place-based projects, maps and photos. Documentation of ownership. If you want to receive the funding directly, you need to have certificates of good standing and your 501c3 certification. And then supporting materials like letters of support and applicable reports. And then the conflict of interest disclosure and the campaign contribution disclosure are mandatory forms that the city has to collect in order to be able to release funds.
So did we miss the Conservation Commission?
We said that in one of the iterations, I'm not sure.
So it's the Planning Board, Parks and Open Space.
It was Parks and Open Space.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, so you can say all five, sorry.
So it's the Planning Board, Parks and Open Space, Conservation Commission, Historic Preservation, and the Housing Authority.
Okay. Sorry about that. But thank you, Uma, for thinking of that. So in addition to the kind of what everybody needs to submit, if you have a historic project, you need to show your documentation of historic significance and a condition report for the resource. And if you want to do construction, you need to have this list of documents showing exactly what it is you plan to do. And that's the process. So if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
If you get rejected, can you apply, is it annually or is it monthly?
It's annually, unless there is an emergency situation or like a time-sensitive situation that would merit a special consideration.
general questions on this form. So project name, I'm assuming that that is a relatively informal process. That you can name it whatever you want to name it, and at some point that may change.
That's correct. It's just to kind of give an idea of what the project encompasses.
For the property owner, this is specific to the particular project that I'm interested in, but I think the city owns the land the schools are on, is that correct?
That's correct. The city owns school land.